Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Teacher Talk. Today we've got a teacher trainer from Ireland, Erin. She's with us to tell us about lexical approach and how to work with emergent language. So, hi Erin,
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. Before anything, why did you become a teacher and how did it all start?
Good question. It was probably because I didn't know what else to do, but I always felt like teaching in some way would be a good path because it means you can serve people, and I love serving people. I think that's really important. Job satisfaction. I was never one of those. I mean, obviously, we'd all love to earn more money, but I can't stand the thought of doing a job that I hate. So, teaching is, it's extremely enjoyable in a lot of ways. But I soon discovered that my passion was actually teacher training.
Mhm. Okay, all right. And did you start teacher training right away on your own, or was there like a school that you started as a head teacher?
So I've always worked for private language institutions, and around 2015, they asked me to be part of the teacher training team, groups of teachers coming over on the Erasmus program and just doing workshops and things with them. And I just discovered that I just really loved it. And I think there's a lot of teachers who they might be good teachers, but there seems to be a lot of gaps in their knowledge, especially I found secondary school teachers. Um,
Mm.
yeah, there are so many sort of things that I do in my job that they don't necessarily do in their job. And I just think that the good thing about teaching is you can never stop improving and you can never stop learning and trying new things. And I think one of the beauties of our job is you can try new things. There's no one size fits all, which I say all the time. But that can also be an issue because teachers often want a quick fix because they're tired, they're overwhelmed, they're burnt out, and they just like, help me. But it doesn't always work like
Mm.
that. But I try to provide through my podcast and my courses, I try to provide real sort of practical activities and tasks that teachers can implement like in their next class that they don't need to think
Mm.
too hard about and that doesn't require too much preparation because that's the last thing I want is to add even more onto the teacher's plate. So it's all about practical tasks that you can do immediately, which is why the lexical
Mm.
approach is very appealing.
Yeah, yeah. It is actually appealing. It is gaining a lot of interest in my country as well. I hear a lot of teachers talk about it and implementing and they've been reading on them. I know a few books on lexical approach that, I've encountered on my friends' stories, while they're reading it. And so how did you come across this lexical approach?
It was during lockdown, really, like everybody, I was kind of bored and I just started doing a bit more reading and research because, again, as teachers, we're very busy and we don't always have time to do it, you know? So I just discovered it and watched some YouTube videos, read a couple of books. I did a couple of interviews with an expert for my podcast, and I just started just implementing it in different ways and trying things out. And I just think it makes perfect sense. Maybe we should talk about what the lexical approach is, just in case people don't really
Definitely.
understand. Um, so the best way of saying it is it's more of an approach to how you look at language. And the most basic sort of tenet of it is language is not made up of individual words. It's made up of chunks of language. So you can take a few individual words, put them together, and create a phrase or a fixed expression or an institutionalized expression, which we can talk a little bit more about later. Um, but it's also important to make your students understand that as well, so that they're not. I mean, I'm sure we've all had this experience where a student's reading a text and they focus on one word and they say, "Teacher, what does this mean?" Um, but they haven't looked left, they haven't looked right, and they haven't understood it's part of a phrase. And just that kind of looking at a phrase rather than just looking at one word can really benefit the student because we tend to sort of translate every word, but that's not how chunks of language work. They have their own meanings. So if you take
Mhm.
something like the word bother or bothered on its own as an adjective, I'm bothered could mean I'm annoyed or a little bit stressed or something. But the phrase I can't be bothered has a completely different meaning. But the student will focus on that bothered. They will go to their dictionary, they will look up annoyed, upset, or whatever. And then they will look at the sentence, I can't be bothered, and give it the completely wrong meaning.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's
the
super
opposite.
useful. Huh?
It's the opposite. It's exactly the opposite meaning.
Yeah, exactly. So this sort of awareness of chunks and phrases is super important. So that's kind of the
Mhm.
lexical approach in its most basic form.
Mhm. Thank you so much. I encountered it first when I was I was told by one of my supervisors to focus only on the meaning of the words. I was teaching vocabulary at some point, and he told me when you're teaching words, you have to present it at least in the sentence that they had just read in a passage in a text, because you don't want them to think about all the other meanings that this word might imply in other contexts. You're only focusing here on this sentence, how it means and what it means here. So I think lexical approach with its I mean the very fact that we have something called lexical approach, it's been defined, it's been talked about and things like that, it somehow bridges that gap for teachers. It just makes it so much easier for them as well. Because it's sometimes so difficult for us too when planning, like focusing on single words and analyzing every meaning and everything. But yeah, as you said in a phrase, that'd be a lot easier for the teacher and the student.
Yeah. And just to talk about teaching whole sentences from the source material, you're absolutely right. And very often it's a good idea to, we're often taught to pre-teach language before a listening or a reading. Um, but again, we're usually told to pre-teach a word. Um,
Yeah.
so what I tend to do is if there's a word that I know that it's new, I will pre-teach the whole sentence from the source material, from the audio, from and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with helping your students understand it. Like reading and listening shouldn't be a test. It should be something that students can read and answer the questions achievably, if you like. So giving them the whole sentence is just makes more sense to me. And also with
Definitely.
when you're teaching or you're putting new language on the board, definitely as much context as you can. And I know that it takes more time, but I think it's worth it. And one thing that's really nice to do is, I mean, let's use that expression, I can't be bothered again. You could do
Mhm.
it like, I should go to the gym today, but I can't be bothered. Or you could put it in a two-line dialogue, like, did you go to the gym today? I should have, but I couldn't be bothered, So you've got that little exchange because, again, the lexical approach is very much about real world communication, conversation, and that kind
Mhm.
of everyday interaction that we have. And a lot of students I find are very fixated on, like, what's the proper way of saying it? And it's like, what does that
Mhm.
even mean? How you should be concerned with what you need every day.
Mhm. Mhm. And it's very important for them to learn a new word in the context, because that's probably the only way they're going to retain that kind of information in their brain for longer periods, and they may be able to make it active in a shorter span of time. Yeah, yeah, that's very important. All right, and what are some of the challenges of applying a lexical approach in a regular communicative English class?
To be honest, I don't really see that many drawbacks or challenges. I think the biggest challenges with anything new, you have to be brave enough to try new things. And you have to also accept the fact that the first time you do it, it might not go as you planned. That
Hmm.
goes for everything. Um, but I suppose just keep a balance. Don't just do everything lexically. Like
Hmm.
it's very good for low level learners because I mean, if you imagine the first time you learn another language, it's generally chunks. How are you? My name is. So chunks can be super useful in that way. But like when you're doing grammar, you can incorporate the lexical approach into it. But if students kind of want rules and expect rules, which they usually do, even though there are some people who say you don't need that, I haven't quite got there yet because I use a balance of sort of the rules and showing lots of institutionalized and common phrases using that particular grammar. So just it's a balance, but again, like just step by step, try a couple of new things, see how it goes, share with your students. You know, we're doing this because what do you think? Is this useful? Okay, try something else the next day and just gradually implement it into the core of your teaching. That's the best advice I can give. I just think it, like I
Uh,
said, it makes sense. I don't see that many drawbacks with it. You just have to try new things, do a bit of research, try more new things, and
mm,
just, yeah, go for it.
sure. Now, talking about the benefits of it, I think one of the biggest benefits is helping you with the teaching of grammar, especially in an EFL context that I come from. It's really important, and I think it's even more important than the name of rules and everything. But I will also like you to talk about how much planning do you think the teacher should do when applying lexical approach to teach grammar or like vocabulary, lexis
Um,
in general.
yeah, with grammar, it's very interesting because the most prep I think you should do is finding good examples of the language, finding good chunks. Like I always use this example. Um, I Googled the passive once, right? Just passive example sentences. And the things that came up were things like the turkey was eaten by the dog, the file has been moved, the trip will always be remembered by John. Things that we never, ever, ever say. And also a lot of the exercises in the books, the gap fills, it's like just these
Mhm.
isolated sentences that have no context and we would never say, like, she is eating a burger. When would we ever say that? I've seen that on a worksheet. She is eating a burger. Like, so, you know, you have to think, what would I use? Right. So if you think of the passive, what I'm just going to ask you now, Hamid, what are the sort of the three most common verbs you think we use with the passive?
Uh, s- I've seen said, maybe it is said that it's believed that, I don't know, it is considered.
Yeah, in a more academic, formal context,
Yeah,
absolutely,
yeah.
or in newslet articles. But like in an everyday context, things like made,
Mm,
born, cancelled,
mm,
delayed, you know, delivered, maybe, because everyone uses delivery
mm,
services now. So you have to kind of look at your examples you have in your textbook or your worksheet or whatever sources you're using and ask yourself, is this a realistic sentence? And
mm,
if it's like a 1 to 10 gap fill, I would say try and avoid it because what you're doing, all you're doing is basically asking that student to change a verb form. Please put this in the verb form of the passive, right? It's very mechanical and it doesn't increase your students' understanding. And you find a lot of the time that with grammar, they don't always process or understand the rules immediately. So if you're asking them to do a gap fill with verb forms, that doesn't help them process. And we've all had this where we've taught something like the passive or the present perfect, and the next week they don't remember, they don't know because they haven't had time to process. So using those
mm.
real world examples is really, really interesting. I mean,
Yep.
useful. So two things you can do. One thing is you can create a list yourself. Brainstorm, what would I say? Secondly,
Mhm.
look on some grammar websites. Look at the example sentences. Some of them are good, some of them are terrible. But if you see the same examples coming up in different grammar websites, that tells you something. That tells you, okay, maybe this
Mhm.
is a useful phrase or expression. Another thing you can do is ask ChatGPT. Ask it to mine 10 language websites and find the most common phrases or the most common verbs. I did this with present continuous because very often with present continuous, we focus on the actions now. And then again, we get those sentences like she is eating a burger. But if you look at the top 10 verbs used, it's things like doing, coming, going. So, how do we use that? And also, we tend to focus on the now rather than around now. So, for example, how often do you talk about what you're doing now versus what you're doing around now? For example, I'm watching Vikings on Netflix at the moment. It doesn't mean I'm watching it right now. It just means I started watching it and I'm going to finish it sometime in the future. Or I'm not feeling great these days. Or I'm not going, stuff like that. I'm going to the gym a lot, or I'm not
Mhm.
going to the gym a lot.
I'm
Um,
learning English, something like that.
yeah.
Like as a student.
Sorry.
Like as a student, I'm learning English. I
Yeah.
don't know,
Yeah,
something
or
like
I'm
that.
staying with my friend, it's not
Hmm.
just a second, it's like, So that's another thing you have to consider. What real world phrases are we going to use? So use
Hmm.
the internet to help you. And then another thing you can do is I tend to create a lot of exercises on my own, but again, you can use ChatGPT to help speed up the process. So rather than 10 isolated sentences, ask ChatGPT to create a dialogue or a paragraph so you have context. And then two choices rather than fill the gaps, have two choices like I go or I'm going. And then there's just a little bit more engagement with the language there. And then students have to think, okay, and they're making that decision themselves. And then they're just like circling or maybe matching sentence halves. You're giving them the input. You're not necessarily asking them to produce, but you're giving them really good examples. Again, real world language, and they're just matching the halves of the sentences. Or dialogues, two mini dialogues, 2 lines. You put the first line over here on the left, 10 of them, second line over here on the right, 10 of them, and they match them. So you've got real world conversation with really good language. And that it doesn't take too long to prepare, but my advice would be just check very carefully what ChatGPT produces because sometimes it's not completely correct. But yeah, you can use that just to help you create those exercises rather than using the ones in the book that are no good or spending hours and hours trying to find those worksheets that aren't very good.
Hmm. And also about grammar, I can say that while doing, yes, definitely they have to do their own research before taking it into class. I think apart from the activity is real life examples, frequent phrases and stuff like that. They have to be able to think about the concept of the grammar
Yeah.
within that context.
Yeah.
They have to be ready for that. As non-native speakers, as EFL teachers, you have to like go to a reference grammar book and check what exactly it means in those sample sentences because you don't want, especially at lower levels, because you don't want students to like think about everything possible about that grammar. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, you have to kind of limit it. But again, using those real world institutionalized phrases can help. So if
Mhm.
you're doing like, let's say the present perfect, um, if you think about have you ever, right? You could finish that question in any way possible. There are so many options, but what are the top 5 ways that you would use that? Have you ever been
Have you
to?
ever had a,
Yeah. Have
yeah.
you ever tried sushi or something? Have you ever seen? So stick to a small group of phrases that they will see again and again and again.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, all right. I think also some dictionaries have got lists for different CEFR levels like V1, V2. They can focus on some of them, find as you said, context and some very frequent phrases. Yep, yep. I thank you so much. Now,
No worries.
um, we also want to talk about working with emergent language because that also goes somehow hand in hand with lexical approach. Students always, um, if they can build up that courage to be creative with their language, uh, there is work for the teacher to do now. What can we do there?
Okay, well, first of all, let's talk about what emergent language is. It's basically any language that students produce that isn't prescribed by you. So if you think
Mhm.
about, presenting grammar, doing the gap fill or whatever, and then getting them to produce something, that's something that you have asked them to produce. Um, if they come into class and they say, sorry for late, that's emergent language because it's a little bit wrong and you can correct it. If they ask you, teacher, how do you say this? That's emergent language. If they're having a discussion and they say anything, that's emergent language because they're producing it. It's student generated, if you like. So that's what emergent language is. And I find that it's best to try and leave a little bit of space in your lesson for that because we tend to plan like every minute of our lesson. which never goes to plan anyway. So my advice would be under prepare, leave some space, and listen to your students. Even if you ask them at the beginning of the class, what did you do at the weekend, right? What did you do yesterday? This is a fantastic opportunity for your students to give you some emergent language because there are so many little mistakes they make there. I went gym, I go pub. I went walk with dog. I went for a walk. So and then or things like you can also elevate your students' language. So if say a B2 student says, I don't have enough money for this, it's I can't afford it. So you're elevating. So you're taking what they say. It's not always about correcting, but it's about giving them, how would I say this? Yeah. So that's your question is how would I say this? So you can do a mixture of little grammar errors, but also just rephrasing. It's called reformulation. So how would you
Mhm.
reformulate what your student said so that it sounds like what a native speaker or like a real world conversation sounds like. And you can do this in different ways. Generally, feedback at the end is very good. Give them a chance to chat and then write a few things on the board. How can we change this, guys? I never use the word correct. How can we change this? And talk about it and
Mhm.
get them to record it. And that's super important. Record it yourself and get your students to record it as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think the recording, I think it begins with the recording on the part of the teacher. It begins at the beginning of the class, depending on how occupied you are with everything. You can write down all the time, and by the end of the session, in like a feedback stage at the end, as you said, yeah, putting up all the language, sometimes even praising them for really good language,
Yep.
and even elevating that as well.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And one more thing I noticed. A lot of fellow teachers tell me that when using lexical approach, because like I'm good at general English, I mean, I as a hypothetical teacher that says that. Um, because I'm good at GE, I know what words go with like just like what you said right now, like what verbs go in what grammar structures usually. It's based on your experience with the language. And they feel like, okay, now that means that I don't need to do any research. I already know that we usually use have you ever tried? So I'm gonna stick with that every time I have a B1 level. Doesn't that instill a
Excuse me.
certain idleness? Wow.
Doesn't it lead to
Is
idleness? I mean, it depends on
Yeah.
the teacher. I mean, if a teacher generally puts in a bit of work or a lot of work, they'll do the research. If they're happy and content with the way that they're going, they won't.
Mm, mhm. I mean, to what extent is that I mean, how much do I know as a teacher? Like I've been teaching for 2, 3 years. I don't even know how to because as you said, teachers sometimes want to have that, like, okay, let's do this. It's fast and done. This is the solution to all my problems. I'm not going to be tired anymore in my classes. Yes, that is true about lexical approach and working with emergent language. But I think what makes it easy for teachers like you and experienced teachers is that they put a lot of research in the first few, at least months of using this consistently in their classrooms until they become a little bit more comfortable with doing it faster. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, anything new. It's going to be a little bit
Mhm.
tricky at the beginning. It's going to take you some time to do the research and all of that. But once you've done it and you've got it. But I mean, you could do any approach. You could try anything new and it's the same every time. That first it will be slow, but it's a process. And I say this all the time to my teachers and my students. Everything is a process. And again, there's no quick fix solution. You have to put the work in. Like if somebody's listening to this podcast and they agree with everything we say, they still have to put the work in to take the action, to make the change and do the research.
Exactly, exactly. That's so true. And I'm gonna use this time to also add to what you said about the sources for researching. I think teachers also can use Ngram, Google Ngram, to see how frequent a phrase is versus another. as an example, I was teaching some language about the beach, and I taught students to say, not to say, but as an alternative to sunbathe, I told them take a sunbath. And a native speaker teacher who was observing me told me that that's not even nearly as usual as sunbathing. And that's what I hadn't checked. So I went on and checked on Ngram, and that was, yeah, definitely true. So Ngram is one. Another one could be COCA, Corpus of Contemporary American English. Um, you can also find a lot of real world sentences and examples, especially if you're teaching higher levels. And about grammar, I think I use Swan's book, How English Works, I think, if I'm not mistaken, mostly. But I also check websites like Cambridge, I don't know, British Council, sometimes like Oxford, other websites that are available.
Yeah, and I think also, I think especially if you're a non-native speaker, and especially if you learned English some years ago, language changes and evolves. So you have to keep up to date. So, watch as many, I don't know, TikTok, YouTube videos as you can. Go on social media, go on Netflix, watch as many foreign, like English programs as you can, or listen to podcasts. I mean, I suppose the advantage English learners and English teachers have is that English is so global. It's
Mhm.
everywhere and you can access it. You can.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, but
That's
again,
so
like
true.
it's I suppose the thing is that it does take a lot of headspace to do that. It can be even if your English is proficient, sometimes it's very draining to watch an hour program or even a
Mhm.
20-minute
I do
program.
that.
So you have to push yourself to do it or maybe read something. Again, it's very tiring. So I do understand when a lot of teachers don't do that, but I would say try something more bite-sized, couple of minutes, YouTube, something like that. And then once your brain kind of trains itself to notice chunks rather than words, you'll know, that's a good phrase. Oh, that phrasal verb. I didn't know that one. Because phrasal verbs are chunks, and we all know what a nightmare phrasal verbs are. It's very contextual. You have to have the context for it. But watching small bite-sized chunks of things if is better than nothing, I think. But definitely try to keep up to date with the language and expose yourself in as many ways as your brain and your energy is able to.
That is indeed a great advice, especially for teachers who have just begun on this journey of teaching and learning at the same time. As you said, it's both at the same time.
Mm.
All right, Erin, thank you so much for taking the time. This was really useful. You taught me things, and I know that a lot of teachers will definitely learn from all these information.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Sure. Have a good time. See you soon.
Bye bye.